Welcome to Hub Dialogues. I'm your host, Sean Speer, editor-at-large at the Hub. I'm honored to be joined today by Beena Goldenberg, the CEO of Organigram Global, one of Canada's leading cannabis companies. I'm grateful to speak with her in particular about the future of Canada's cannabis sector. Nearly 7 years after legalization, much of the public conversation is still framed through the lens of public health and safety. That made sense at the time, but if cannabis is to realize its full potential, we now need to broaden the discussion to include its role as a driver of economic growth, innovation, and opportunity. This means rethinking outdated tax and regulatory policies that treat the industry narrowly as a risk to be contained rather than an opportunity to be cultivated. The conversation you're about to hear is part of a multi-episode series the Hub is proud to produce in partnership with Organigram. Our aim is to capture how the cannabis sector can be repositioned as a source of economic growth and opportunity, and how public policy needs to evolve accordingly. Beena, thanks for joining us at Hub Dialogues.
It's a pleasure being here.
I've been really looking forward to this conversation ever since I read the report produced in partnership with the Canadian Chamber of Commerce that dug into the economics of Canada's cannabis industry. We'll dig into the report and try to understand the different ways in which the industry is making a contribution to the Canadian economy and how, in fact, there's room to grow that contribution. But before we get there, I thought I'd put a scene-setting question to you just about the nature of the industry itself. I suspect a lot of our listeners and viewers, the extent to which they've interacted with the industry, it's principally at retail outlets purchasing cannabis products. Why don't you talk a bit about Organigram and how it fits into a broader continuum from production to distribution to ultimately those involved in the retailing of cannabis products in Canada?
Sure. So first of all, Organigram is the leading cannabis company in Canada by market share. And we have our largest flagship facility out in Moncton, New Brunswick. It's over 500,000 square feet. So very large facility, producing over 100,000 kilograms of cannabis. So the cannabis starts with cultivation. Now we are a large producer, but there are micro cultivators across the country in lots of rural neighborhoods and parts of the country. So you've got cultivation, and then you have processing. This is where you get the cannabis into packaging, into pre-rolls. We have another facility in Winnipeg that does edibles, so the cannabis gummies you buy, it does beverages. We have a facility in rural Quebec that does hash products. So we have a facility in Aylmer, Ontario, so rural Ontario,
Sure.
where we have extracts, where we make vapes. So you've got production after cultivation, and then you have distribution. You're shipping the product across the country, right? We're retailing it from coast to coast. Up in the Yukon, you're retailing it to Crown corporations or to independent retailers. Everything goes through the provincial distributors. So it's a very large, complicated supply chain across the country.
Which is a good segue into a question about the scale of the cannabis sector in Canada. I was surprised to learn from the report produced in partnership with the Canadian Chamber of Commerce that it's now responsible for something like $16 billion of in economic output and support something like 227,000 jobs. Why don't you talk a bit about the growth of the industry and why it may be happening below the radar of policymakers?
Right. So first of all, as you mentioned, I mean, 16 billion in GDP in 2024, right? Like that's big. 8.4 billion of that is direct, tied to cultivation and processing and retailers. And then the other 7.6 billion tied to suppliers, packaging suppliers, logistics suppliers, professional services, and the like. So very large industry. Yet what we have is a problem with our current our current excise regime. It's set at the assumption of $10 a gram, which was what, when it first went legal, the assumption was it would sell at $10 a gram. You can't fault a government who never had a legal cannabis segment for setting that assumption. But the reality today is that on average, it sells at $3 a gram. So when you set excise at 10%, the expected retail price, and you set it as $1 a gram, yet we're now retailing at $3, you're paying over 30% excise on everything, which then again suppresses further margins, further investment and innovation. And so really we've been pushing for policy change, but really policy for the government tends to be in long-standing mature industries like auto, oil and gas, tech, and it really hasn't been given the same treatment as those, despite the really large GDP contribution that cannabis generates.
Well, we're going to get into some of those policy issues because they're so fascinating. And I suspect will be of great interest to our audience members, even if they're not particularly familiar with or interested in the cannabis sector, because they speak to Canada's capacity to be nimble and responsive to changing industries and new technologies. And as you say, our inability to be uh, nimble and responsive to development of Canada's cannabis industry is representing a barrier to growth. Um, One possible explanation may be that up until now, a lot of policymakers have either seen the industry through the lens of enforcement or maybe consumer product, but haven't actually thought about it as a genuine source of economic growth as an industry. Why don't you talk a bit, Beena, about that disconnect, the need to broaden the way that policymakers and in fact the Canadian public itself is thinking about the opportunity for Canada's economy when it comes to the cannabis sector.
Yes, certainly. So, first of all, part of the reason we did this economic impact report with the Chamber of Commerce was to shed the light on the size of this industry because people don't really understand it. Really, you're talking about not only 16 billion in GDP, but we're talking about a high spillover, high employment sector, right? You've got retail activity, which supports 14 jobs for every $1 million of output. And every dollar in retail adds about $1.06 to the GDP. So for policymakers, that means dollars are spent in the legal channels produce above average productivity and community payoffs, right? We've got supply chains that include farming and manufacturing and logistics and testing and professional services. It's a broad industry. So we really need to be treated as a strategic industry, right? And this is no different than an agri-foods or clean manufacturing, because this kind of industry does scale into middle class jobs and extra tax revenue and stronger supply chains. Those are all priorities under the One Canadian Economy lens that the government is talking about.
Yeah. Well, in that vein, a key finding of the report is the distribution of economic activity stemming from the cannabis sector across the country. Ontario, British Columbia, and Quebec, for instance, are something like 80% of the sector's GDP impact. Talk a bit about cannabis as a source of broader regional economic development, particularly in rural or agricultural communities that may be in search of sources of economic diversification.
Yes, certainly. So, look, we already know micro cultivators are across the country and cannabis facilities are across the country. And even when we talk about Organigram in particular, our facility, our largest facility is in Moncton, New Brunswick, right? So, we're not just talking about the big provinces, it's across the country. And it's, this is through cultivation, through processing. And then you have the knock on of transportation, packaging, the build out of the facilities. So when you think about, for example, in the report, they talk about the farm gate data, which reinforces that cannabis was $2.7 billion in farm cash receipts in 2024. I mean, that is bigger than field vegetables and greenhouse vegetables. So it's a strong farm cultivate a strong farm cash receipt product. And like when you look at New Brunswick, in New Brunswick, cannabis is the most valuable crop, even greater than potatoes. So we're getting into big numbers here. So the point here is we are across the country. It does exist across the country. And what we're really looking for is a targeted policy from the government, where you modernize the excise, you harmonize some of the compliance, you get us export ready, and we can cannabis can be part of regional diversification across the country. It's just not big province; it is across the country.
Yeah, fascinating insights there. You mentioned earlier the sector as a source of mid-skilled or middle-class employment. As I understand it, there's something like about 170,000 direct jobs that have been created in the sector through across the spectrum from cultivation, processing, and ultimately retail. Talk a bit about the skills and pathways that are growing out of the industry, and how does it compare, for instance, to opportunities in more traditional agricultural or resource sectors?
Well, so for example, in our flagship facility in Moncton, New Brunswick, this is a full indoor facility, three-tiered, controlled environment agriculture. So this is more than just you're growing it outdoors. It's controlled. You're doing things like managing humidity and lighting and temperature and nutrients. It's quite an extensive work around controlled agriculture. But then there's also, QA and QC lab science. There's advanced manufacturing automation at the back end as we're producing pre-rolls. There's supply chain and retail programs. So just compared to traditional agriculture, cannabis sort of blends both agri-tech and GMP processing. So you get into these things where you could have portable skills into the food industry, as an example,
Yes.
or into pharma adjacent manufacturing, or into logistics. So it really builds a skilled workforce beyond just cultivation.
Our listeners and viewers will know of Canada's strong reputation globally when it comes to agriculture and agri-food. Of course, it's been a sector identified by successive governments as one where Canada has comparative advantage, and one might even characterize it as strategic. Talk a bit, Beena, about cannabis as being a natural extension of that story. What would it take, for instance, for the government to begin to treat cannabis as a strategic agricultural resource rather than a tightly regulated substance?
Right. So, like the report's agricultural lens, it showed that it's quite a compelling story. Cannabis was 2.7 billion in farm cash receipts, as we talked about earlier in 2024, and outpacing greenhouse vegetables that were 2.6 billion, field vegetables that are 2.4 billion. So it's really one of Canada's top value crops. So for the government really should be treating it properly. Then, and we're talking about, yes, maintain the strict public health standards, that's important, but integrate cannabis into agri-food programs, into innovation and sustainability and export development programs. Recognize it as a core agricultural commodity as well as a manufacturing value add. That will make the difference, and really take an opportunity, again, back to the one Canadian economy lens of looking for something new. Cannabis is there and ready.
Yeah, let's stay on this subject of export opportunity, because I suspect it's not something a lot of people have thought about. When cannabis was legalized, it was principally conceived along domestic lines. As we've been discussing, it was an extension of public health policy, or possibly law enforcement or substance issue policy, and over time the sector has developed such that now it needs an economic policy lens, or as you say, an agricultural lens. And in that vein, uh, the conversation around the export opportunities is for those outside the sector, as I suspect, still nascent. Talk a bit about possible opportunities to export Canadian cannabis products abroad, how Canada's competitiveness compares to global competitors in the area, and then finally, of course, what kind of policy changes one would need to see to position cannabis as a bona fide export industry along, say, beef or grain or energy.
So first of all, the global market, cannabis market, is projected to be about $140 billion by 2026. And what we're seeing is markets continuing to open up. They usually start opening up to medical cannabis and then they convert over to recreational cannabis, very similar to what happened in Canada. So the market is growing. Every month you're hearing of another country that's reevaluating it. It's a big opportunity. Organigram, we currently ship product to Australia, to the UK, to Germany. We have shipped to Israel in the past. There are more countries in Europe that are opening up every day. It is a big opportunity. And this is what Canada has. The advantage we have is we're a first mover. We legalized earlier, so we've had many more years to cultivate product, to learn how to grow, to make great quality product. And it's known worldwide, Canada produces great quality product. So what we need is we needed to address some of the policy gaps so we could take advantage of this first mover advantage to get out there. So what we talked about before, we need a national export strategy. So, included trade promotions, market access, those kind of things that get other commodities are out there in these programs. We need the excise modernization to reflect reality of pricing so that we have the ability to reinvest in more capacity or in innovation to continue our first mover advantage. We need regulatory streamlining. There was a lot of talk several months ago about removing interprovincial barriers. Yet we
Yes.
have to put different stamps on every product that we ship if we ship to different provinces. So what that means is if we're producing product and we put on a stamp for Ontario and we get an order from Manitoba, I can't ship it to Manitoba. I got to remove the stamps and put new stamps on. Now, there is no benefit, no safety benefit, no benefit to the government. This is just an avoidable cost if we get that streamlined. And finally, something like innovation support. If we're talking about being a global commodity, being able to capitalize on cannabis as an export strategy, there needs to be more R&D. There needs to be more automation into this. We need that, and that's what other strategic sectors are getting, but we're not getting. So this would convert our domestic leadership into what would be an enduring export capacity, along with segments like beef and grain and energy, like you mentioned.
Let's spend a bit of time drilling into those policy issues because they're fascinating. As you say, part of the policy process over the past several years has been one of trial and error, trying to figure out the best set of policies to support the creation of a genuinely new sector. And so one could understand a bit why policymakers have, at different points, have struggled to make sure that policies are efficient and effective. But we're now several years in, and we ought to have learned some things over this process and continue to adjust our policies in light of the gathering evidence. So let's spend a moment on excise because I suspect a lot of our listeners and viewers may not fully understand what was the original policy, what is the policy that you and others in the industry are calling for, and what is the negative effects of the status quo?
Right. So again, and we talked about this briefly earlier, but when the policy was first put into place, they assumed that a product would sell $10 a gram and said 10% seemed like the right excise rate. So they put in $1 a gram. However, today the reality is set in. We're selling at about $3 a gram. So it's over 30% excise. The
So
issue,
just pause there for a second. And so, if I understand correctly, through market forces, supply and demand has reached an equilibrium at a much lower price than the government anticipated. But because the excise rate hasn't changed, it is highly punitive at the price point that the market has settled at.
correct. And just for perspective, the excise rate today is 12 times that of beer, and sorry, 12 times that of wine and 6 times more than beer. So you're talking about very high rates of excise on our product. So that is an issue. Now, look, you can't fault them. They put in these rules early days, but there was a plan after 3 years to review the regulations. That 3 years became four because of COVID, understandable. But after 4 years, there was a review. And unfortunately, instead of the review having anybody at the table from industry, it was a review of with doctors. And it was all about the public health side, which is important, but there was no view to the industry side. So excise wasn't really highlighted. And actually, in fairness to Dr. Rosenberg, who was leading the cannabis review, he did come back and say, you got to fix this. If 10% was the assumption and it's selling at $3, go to 10%. Forget the dollar per gram. Like
Yeah,
that was the
sure.
recommendation. And it was a recommendation put forward to in the Standing Committee of Finance before the last budget, before and the last legal Liberal government. So there was recommendation to go back to 10%. That's what we're looking for. That would give some room for companies to reinvest in innovation, reinvest in expansion, add more jobs. I mean, this is an economic driver. Why not take advantage of it? But that change hasn't been made. And so it's almost getting to deaf ears at this point, and we have to make a change. So this is why we invested in getting more information, getting this economic data to say, you know what, this is time. This move cannabis from Health Canada, move it into ag. So it could be an economic pillar. Get some of these changes made. So fix the excise. The other one that I talked about, the stamps, like that is not benefiting any public health issue, and yet it's costing the industry. I believe I've heard numbers upwards of $100 million of complexity to the business as a result of this.
Wow.
Why not change it? There's no tax revenue difference to the government. Seemed like low-hanging fruit. Still haven't been able to make that change. That's the kind of thing we need.
Yeah, well, just to stay on the excise tax issue for one more minute, a key principle of policymaking is to have a degree of symmetry and consistency across different parts of the economy. You mentioned the disproportionate excise tax on cannabis relative to different alcohol products. My understanding it's the same when it comes to cigarettes. Is that right?
That's correct. So they put on a lens of cannabis like cigarettes as opposed to like alcohol. And we look at it and say, you know what, we make cannabis beverages. Why is it treated like cigarettes? We make cannabis gummies. It's very interesting. We have very strict regulations, and we don't have a problem to have the kind of safety standards, right? This is something that's important for the industry. It wasn't there when people were accessing the product through the illicit market. But we compete against the illicit market, and the illicit market is still 30% out there. And when you talked about pricing, why did pricing come down to $3 per gram? Because we had to compete against the illicit market to convert people over for them to come in and buy legal cannabis. So we had to price down. That came out of the producers' profit margins to come down. So you got the government goal of moving people from the illicit market into the legal market. So you're getting the benefit of all the regulations, all the safety steps that are put into place. Those cost the producers a lot of money. We're still competing against the illicit market that isn't paying any of those. They don't do those regulations, the Health Canada audits, all the safety protocols, and yet we run the burden of all those costs, yet have to compete on price. So this is where we're looking to the government to say, you know what, if 10% was the original thought, go to 10%. Like it's not that, yes, there will be an impact to overall tax revenues, but let me give you a set of numbers just for perspective.
Please.
In 2024, our fiscal year 2024, Organigram generated $87 million for government in tax revenues, but our profit was $8.4 million. $87 million went to tax revenues, and that's okay. It's important. The country obviously needs tax revenues, but for us to get the benefit of this sector, get more of that investment back where we could expand add more innovation, add more jobs. There is markets opening globally, $140 billion industry globally, and we have first mover advantage. And yet we're putting up barriers to growth in Canada where we can. Again, the prime minister, even the leader of the opposition party, they all said we're looking for new ideas to help grow the Canadian economy. Cannabis is out there. We've been legal for over 7 years. It's time to recognize it as truly an economic driver, what this report shows, and take advantage of it. And that's the purpose of doing these kind of podcasts and these reports, is to take that message out.
Yeah, well, it's a compelling message. And if you'll permit me, just one more question, because I think it's such a fascinating example where policy is in conflict with the government's own stated objectives. Just in basic terms, help our audience understand the the disproportionately high excise tax. What's its transition mechanism? Like, how does it affect consumers and producers?
Right. So it affects producers probably more because the producers are paying it, and
Yeah,
and as a result of that, it um, suppresses margins, and as a result,
got it.
facilities are shut down. So jobs were lost in early days, and there's limited amount of money spent on innovation and research. And this is an industry that desperately needs research to promote the benefits of cannabis, and we know, we've seen it in medical cannabis. We need more research, but there's a limit of how much, companies have to be able to pay their employees, and so as a result, look, we need to have this adjustment to fix the economics. What will happen is more companies will start earning money, and as a result, more companies will start paying income tax. Companies aren't making money now, so they're paying a lot of tax revenue, but the government could get it in the other side if companies start making money. And there's a global opportunity out there for companies to make more money.
Let me just put a penultimate question to you, and that is about the issue of a standardized regulation. Talk a bit about uh, what may be motivating policymakers in maintaining this balkanized regime, and why ultimately the costs outweigh any perceived benefits.
This is an industry that still has a stigma. Let's face it. The government, legalized it and then forgot about it. Put it under Health Canada, which really is all about, preventing it,
Yes.
controlling it. And it was never looked at as the economic driver it could be. But we're really showing that this has changed. Yes, it's important to keep the health protections, but put it under ag, treat it as a sector that could drive the economy, as these numbers show, and really take look at how to support this industry as the market opens up globally. We have a first mover advantage. This is very rare that the US is still illegal and we're legal, and the US can't compete on the world stage where we can. Why not take advantage about that and go out there and support this industry to continue to grow, right? If we're sitting here hampered, before you know it, we're hearing, Thailand and South Africa are starting to grow cannabis. We have great quality cannabis. We need the opportunity to capitalize on it.
Well, that brings me to my final question, which in a way uh, gives you a chance to only double down on that positive message of growth and opportunity. What do you want policymakers to take away from this conversation in general, and in particular, the idea that they need to reconceptualize the way that they're thinking about the industry from rather than trying to protect against harm, thinking it through the lens of growth and opportunity?
Right. I'd start off by saying I wish that policyholders would align policy with the economic reality that this report documents. So we already talked about it. Cannabis is already generating 16 billion in GDP and approximately 227,000 jobs. It has a big multiplier effect. It is nationally integrated, a coast-to-coast industry that, as I said, fits with the one Canadian economy. So my message would be, keep the health protections. They're very important. Keep them strong. But modernize taxes, streamline regulation, execute an export strategy so Canada could convert its leadership into a lasting global advantage.
Well, what a great message to wrap up this conversation on. Beena Goldenberg, the CEO of Organigram, thank you so much for joining us at Hub Dialogues.
Thank you for having me.